So no, this is not another great value DaBaby template. Today, I'm leaking the literal, exact, the real,
He ain't lying,
DaBaby mix template. And if we haven't met, I'm Kevin McCloskey with MyAudioAcademy, and I'm the mix engineer behind DaBaby's albums like Baby on Baby and KIRK. So today, we're gonna go over the template for Bob. Let's dive into it. But before we get rolling, we have provided this template as a download down in the description. So you're not gonna have to sit here and screenshot every couple of seconds. With that being said, let's take a look. So first up is template layout. What I typically like to do is I like to put the instruments, or in this case, it was just a 2-track, on the first half of the session, followed by the auxiliary inputs, then the master section. So the mix bus, my print track, and then the master fader. After that, I go the opposite direction, lead bus with all the different tracks that are contributing to the lead, and then the 4 sets of ad-libs, and those are going to the lib bus. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you have something that you can consistently repeat. Repeatable variables yield repeatable results.
he ain't lying.
This song was a lot about vibe. There's not a lot of elements, right? There's just a really solid lead, good ad-libs, and a 2-track. The artist was very specific about wanting to use the 2-track. So we have to make sure that we're enhancing these and making space for the vocals. So something I typically use when I just have a 2-track are transient shapers. So I've used 2 in this chain. The first one is Smack Attack. Now, Smack Attack is going to be an overall transient shaper. So anything that has transient information, which is the initial attack of a sound, as long as it's within this sensitivity setting here, it's going to be triggered. So if a kick drum triggers it, we'll get a little bit more transient response from a kick drum, a snare, a hi-hat. So I just use it a little bit to try to over-exaggerate the transients. Next up, FabFilter Pro Q3. One of my absolute favorite EQ plugins. I wanted a little bit more low end, so I used a small boost at 47, so about 50 hertz. I also did a boost up top to try to get some brightness, because when I added the low end, I felt like it darkened it up. Remember, the artist has a very distinct voice, so we want to make sure that the vocal and the percussion, specifically the snare and the hi-hat, feel within the same mix. We don't want a super crispy vocal and a dull top end, or a really, really bright top end and a dull vocal. They don't really match well. So we offset it with this shelf up here. Then one of my favorite things to do with the Pro Q3, we can do mid-side mode. So when I clicked on it right here, I changed this to mid. And so what that does is it only dips what's going on in the midfield here at about 1,000 hertz, right? So that's where the start of vocal presence starts. I wanted to dip that out in the beat so that the vocals could come through. And then the next, I pulled up the Neutron. So with Neutron, it's a multi-band transient shaper. And I only used the low end on it. So I have the settings here, but only on the low end. And I'm giving it a boost there because I wanted it to punch a little harder. The idea is we're going to over-exaggerate those transients, because when we go into a mastering stage, we're going to lose some of that depth. Next, I kept things pretty simple. I really like Valhalla, right? So Valhalla Vintage Verb. So I used one with just like a standard hall setting. Nothing too special, just give it a nice little bit of space. And then I used the Valhalla Vintage Verb as well, but I used it in chaotic chamber mode, but I use it for just a little bit of like ambient space. There's a short pre-delay on it. We're also allowing a lot more of the higher frequencies through, so that our ears can pick up on it. If we cut those highs out, we can feel it, but I actually wanted to hear it just a little bit. And what that can do is just give a little bit of depth. I didn't mess with the modulation too much, or the early reflections, late reflections, things like that. Next, I used the Valhalla delay, and I mainly only use these on ad-libs. There's 2 delays on the ad-libs. This one is a quarter note delay where I cut the highs out, right? So I just kind of want to give it some space, but without being heard. The lows are also turned up to about 1,000 hertz. And what that's going to do is that's going to give us almost like a telephone effect. So it almost has like a reverb feel, or it'll give you a sense of space as opposed to a delay effect. And then lastly, I used the Valhalla delay, but I used it in ghost mode. The EQ's a little bit higher on it, so the filter's a little higher. Feedback at 36%. And that's just to kind of give a little bit more splashiness to the actual ad-lib. So when he hits the ad-libs, it just creates a little bit more space, a little bit more effect. So next, and typically after I get the low end of my beat worked out, in this case, the 2-track, because I didn't have an option of just doing, drum and bass, I'll do a mastering stage. I really, really like this Brainworks, the BX Master Desk. It sounds super cool when you just put it on. I gave it a little bit more input to work the compressor. So I'm going a dB into it and I'm pulling back a little more than 2 dB, almost 3 dB for the output trim. The mix on the compressor here is 86% as opposed to 100. So I'm doing a little bit of parallel, but I'm still getting some of the original signal through. Everything else I kind of left the same, except for I added a little bit of stereo enhancement on the side. Then I used another Brainworks plugin. For anybody that has the Plugin Alliance bundle, super awesome. Can't recommend it enough. There's a lot of great plugins. I'm dipping a little bit at 260 and I'm dipping a little bit at 11.5K. These are decisions that I make typically at the end of the mix. So things I felt like were a little bit harsh. I wanted to soften them up just a little bit. I did the same thing on the side field. The great thing about the Brainworks is that we can solo each band in the midfield and the side field. So it's really easy to pick out problem spots. It's a great EQ for doing surgical mastering work or even on any other signal. I also use the Bax EQ, the master section. So I split it into mid-side. I did a little bit of boosting on the top from 2.1 up. I also did a little boosting on the side at 18, right? So we're not really going to hear 18 too much, but it'll kind of give us some sparkle. And then I just did a dB boost on the side too to give it a little bit more width. If your beat's kind of like that, drum heavy in the middle, we can boost the sides if you want.
He ain't lying.
Next, I used another EQ and just did some enhancing. So I did some enhancing 1 dB at 56 hertz. I did 1 dB at 4.7 kilohertz, so maybe about 5K. And then I did a half dB at 12K. So I kind of brightened it up on top and added a little oomph on the bottom, and that's it. Very subtle, but just enhances a little bit. And then I used ozone. I just brought the threshold down to where I was hitting the RMS or the LUFS that I wanted. You know, this is going to be variable depending on how you're mixing and how loud you like to mix. I like transient because transient allows my drums to come through how I prefer them, but a lot of great options. But we have a particularly fast release. That way it's more in your face. I'm bringing the threshold down 12.7. You can put that however you want it for it to make sense with however your music is working. And then I'm using a little bit of more transient emphasis. What the limiter squashes, the transient emphasis brings back out, right? So we don't get too flat. Just because we're getting it loud doesn't mean that it has to lose its punch.
He ain't lying.
And that's it for the mastering chain. The next section, all the lead vocals are going to one bus because they're similar. Just as a reminder, we do have a download link for this template in the description. And also, I'm sure some of you really want the breakdown with the actual audio. If this is you, we have also linked my full-length 60-minute mixing course. In this course, I'll go a little bit more in depth behind my process and mixing methods, specifically for the track No Me Ame by Anuel featuring Juice WRLD. And as an extra bonus to the course, I throw in this breakdown with the audio to give you a better understanding of my process. So if this is for you, you can go ahead and click that down in the description. First is an 1176, so CLA 76. So the blue version is modeled after the revision A. They have a little bit more top end distortion, sound great on vocals, guitars. The black version is modeled after the revision D, and those have a little bit more low end distortion, so they sound great on bass and things like that. The 1176 does a really good job of putting things in your face. Ideally, you want to be shooting for like 3 to 5 dB a gain reduction with this, but I like it all the way slow and all the way fast. Remember, it's an incredibly fast compressor, so even at its slowest attack setting, it's still faster than the majority of compressors out there.
I'm fast as boy.
After that, I did a small amount of de-essing at 5.5K. Then the RVox. The RVox is a really cool compressor that pushes vocals in your face and then also does gain adjustment. You need to A/B to make sure that you like what's happening as opposed to just hearing it louder, because once we hear it louder, we're going to think it's better. Next, I used the MV2. They had this low level setting where it can somewhat do what a compressor does, would bring up some of the lower sounds, but it doesn't compress the top unless you mess with the high level. But it can bring up some of the nuances in his voice and the things that are going on low. Next, we're doing just a little bit of EQ boost at 5.5K, just doing it 3 dB. Just to make it cut a little harder. And this is a little secret weapon plugin that I like to use when I have to do things fast. This is a great way to get some good EQ, some good compression, and I really like the reverb on it. So it's CLA guitars, no reamplification in clean mode. I might mess with the compressor, push it a little bit, and leave it in arena. And what that's going to do too is, since we're putting reverb on right now, whatever else we go through compression wise, it's going to make it splash a little bit. It's a fun effect. You should try it out sometime. So next we're using the Fab Filter, the Pro Q3. We're dipping a little bit at 400 to get rid of some of the mud. Then we're doing another dip, almost 6K. That's sometimes unpleasant to the ear. It's a little sharp to the ear. So I'm dipping that out, and then I'm riding the top. So I'm doing a shelf, but it's in dynamic mode. It'll add the brightness that I'm looking for, but if any part comes in that's already bright enough, it will pull back on it. Another instance of RVox, and we hit it hard this time. The idea behind this one is that reverb that was on the CLA guitars, it really pushes that forward and it kind of gets some of the vibe. And that was at the request of the artist. And lastly, I used the back EQ. You know, it's specific shapes, but they're really like low shelf and a high shelf. We cut out the lows, so they have a filter on there. And then on the shelf, I boosted at 116, so that's gonna give us a little bit more warmth. We had thinned the vocals out a little bit to cut through, so we just gave it a little more body. We did another boost about 5K for 3 dB. A cut at the top, it just kind of helped round it out a little bit. Maybe I did it to trick myself, I don't know. And we turned the output down, so a little bit of gain staging there. And the only other thing we did was we actually sent the space. So because we had the reverb with the CLA guitars, I left that. Did a send to the space and just had a negative 30, so very light. And that's just to kind of give it a little bit of depth. And lastly, we have the ad-libs. One thing I like to do sometimes is to put different types of reverb and different type of processing pre-chain on the ad-libs, and then it goes through all the instances of compression. So if you have like a little delay, a little reverb, it really does some cool things with the tail that you're not going to get unless you're doing tons of reverb. So I have the CLA vocals on here and in the tight setting. So a little bit of compression, nothing crazy, taking some of the presence out with the bite, and then just with the tight reverb, all the compression that's about to go through with the chain is going to help push it up. So here we have the comp. So we use this just to lock it in a little bit. Fairly slow attack, for vocals, about almost 20 milliseconds. Fast release, so the fast release is going to put it more in your face. A de-esser, so some of the chain is similar. And then I changed it out in other ways. So our comp, same as last time. I was using the Pro Q3 in a little bit more dynamic mode. So to get rid of some of the presence, some of the mid, and then some of the top, because the idea behind it, I don't want it to sound exactly like the lead vocal, but the artist wanted the ad-libs to be very, very present. So we're doing the same settings with the MV2 on this one. And here, we're using a distressor emulation. They have a very specific sound. Then I used the CLA guitars again because it has a particular vibe to it. So I used the arena setting and the quarter note setting too. So just kind of add a little bit of wetness to it. And then I hit the RVox again for a lot. So like negative 18. So it really is just slamming this in your face. And the idea behind that is I want to catch all these little reverb nuances and delay nuances that I've done prior to the chain and make them splash around. And that's it. It's pretty simple. What's most important is the performance, and we need to enhance that and try to capture that as engineers, and we're not reinventing the wheel all the time. Hopefully you guys can use this, pop it on your tracks if you have a similar vibe, and it's gonna get you to where you wanna be.